So we mentioned in the previous video that there are 3 questions that you need to address in order to start the steps of solving the given problem. And these questions are: what are the inputs, what are the outputs, and how to compute the output given the input. In this specific problem, the first 2 questions are quite straightforward because the inputs and outputs are explicitly mentioned in the problem statement itself. Now note that this is not always the case, because sometimes you will have to make some assumptions about the problem, so it's not going to be as straightforward as it is in this example. However, if you look at the third sentence, it clearly mentions that the input to the problem is 2 things: the length of the field and the width of the field. So these are basically our input to the problem. And the output in this case is the thing that we want to compute. So what do we want to compute? We want to compute the parameter. So the parameter in this case is the output of this problem. And the question is, what do we need to do in order to compute the output? So what is the relationship between the parameter of the field and the given length and width as input? So if you look at it, the parameter is basically calculating the length of all the sides of this rectangular field. So we have as input 2 quantities, the length and the width. However, you need to add the 4 sides in order to find the length of the parameter. So in this case, the parameter is equal to 2 times the length plus the width of the field. So what we are doing, we are taking the length and the width of the field and adding these 2 twice in order to get the full length of the parameter of this field. So now we know what is the input and the output of this problem and how to compute the output from the input. Let us see how to write the Python code for this problem. So we are now ready to write Python code to solve the field parameter problem. So what I did, I created a new Python file called field parameter, and I have the usual comments at the top of my file. Now every time I start writing code in an empty file, I would like to give myself hints about what does the program is doing, and I usually do that in comments. And if you look at this or if you think about this problem and the problems that you will see over the next week, they basically do 3 general things. They take input, they do some computation, and they produce output. How much of each one of these operations will depend on the kind of problem you're looking at. Now in this specific problem, so let me just write down in comments what this program is supposed to do. So it's supposed to take some input and it's supposed to do some calculations, so do or compute something, and then display the result or display the output. Now in this case it takes 2 inputs. Okay, the first input is the length of the field, and the second one is to take as input the width of the field. So it takes basically 2 inputs, the length and the width of the field. And what it's supposed to compute, it's supposed to compute the parameter. So as we have seen, the output of our program is the parameter. So we need to compute or find the value of the parameter and then display the results or display the value of the parameter. So display the value of the parameter. So this sequence of steps that I've just written is called an algorithm. Now an algorithm is a sequence of ordered and precise steps that leads to a solution of a problem think of an algorithm as a recipe or as directions towards a solution. It's very easy to get the impression when you are writing code that writing code is very difficult. This is not true. It's more difficult actually to come up with an algorithm, which is a precise set of steps that actually solves the problem that you have in hand. Once you have an algorithm like the one that I have in here, it's very easy to translate it into code. Once you learn the syntax of a specific programming language, the translation process is quite easy, because you'll have some kind of ready-made templates for how to do each one of these steps. So let's look at how we can actually write these 4 steps in Python code. So the first thing we need to do is we need to take input, and to take input we will use a function as we have done with the output. So in the output we use the print function. In this case we will use the input function to get the input, and the input function takes one single parameter, and that is the message prompt. So the message prompt is basically a message that you display to the user, where you ask the user to give you some kind of input. So what we want to say here to the user: enter the length of the field. So this is a message will be displayed to the user, asking the user to enter some value. Now once we ask the user to enter some value, the user will go in the keyboard, they will type something, they will hit enter. I need to save this value somewhere in order to process it later on, and this is where we actually start using variables, and we'll talk about variables in the next lecture. So let me create a variable, and I'll call this variable length. So think of a variable as a container, and this container will store whatever input that is coming from the user. Now I should be able, because I want to do some computation with this variable, so I want to add it to something else, and I want to multiply it into something else. So I need to make sure that I'm working with the correct kind of data for this variable. So I will have to convert what comes from the user into the correct data type. Again, we'll look at data types in more details in an upcoming lecture. So I will convert this into a floating point data type, and that's going to be my first statement in this program in order to get the input from the user, and this input is the length. To take the input, which is to take the width from the user, we will just copy paste this thing, and we'll follow a similar pattern. So I will create a variable, and I will call it width, and in this case I will ask the user to enter the width as a quantity. So this is going to be the width, and let me just make sure that at least the display looks good enough for the output. Now we have the two quantities, the two input quantities. We have the length and we have the width. The next thing is to compute the parameter, and what I will do, I will take remember the way to compute the parameter is 2, and in Python the multiply is this star, and we want to add the length plus the width. Now this will compute the parameter, but again I want to put this in some container so that I can later on use this container to display the result of the parameter. So again, as you have guessed, we will create a variable, and we'll call this variable parameter, and we will store the result of this computation in that parameter variable. So now we have done the 3 first steps, getting the input and doing the computation. We are ready to do the last steps, which is displaying the value. Remember, if you want to print or if you want to display something to the user, you use the print function. And the way we do it is we give the string function the output. In this case, we will need to display some message, so I'll print some kind of a string. The parameter of the field is, and we will pass to this function multiple arguments. So if you remember from our discussions in the previous lecture, you can separate the different arguments of the print function using a comma, and in this case it's going to take the second argument of this function will be the value of the parameter. So I will pass it that container which is called parameter. So this is basically the our program, or the 4 statements in our program. Let's just test drive this program. So let's run it, and let's say I give it as input 120, and as for the width, let's give it 30, and the result should be that. Okay, so should be 300. You can verify this, so it's basically 120 and plus 120, that's 240, plus 60, that's 300. So the result is correct. Let me modify it a little bit. So I need some kind of I need a good I need to just separate these 2 lines. So I need to separate between the last input and the output of my program. So I'll use /n in the beginning here of the last output line. Sorry, in the print statement, or in the string of the first argument, I'll just add the end of line, which is /n. Let's run this again just to see how it's working. Now you can see here in the input I supplied integers, which are whole numbers. You can also supply basically numbers which has fractions. So the length of the field can be something like 35.5 meters, and the width can be something like let's say 20.17, and the parameter of this field is 111.34. So this is our first program which interacts with the user, and in this case the user is being asked to supply some data into the program. The program goes and does some computation and displays some results. In the next video lectures, we will look at all the concepts, the new concepts that we have seen in this program. So concepts like the input functions, data types, and variables, as well as doing mathematical computations. All of these will be explained in more details in the upcoming videos.